Hi everyone, this is Matthew Jennifer Card Runners, and I'm here with Out of Position 3-Bet Pot Flop Play Part 2 Small Blind vs. Button Play Continued. So quite the mouthful for the title. So the reason why I'm still talking about these ranges is, as I mentioned in the last video, they're probably about the most important 3-betting ranges in poker, and blind versus button open 3-betting ranges, so to make that clear, the button opens and we 3-bet from either the small blind or the big blind, are probably the most important 3-betting ranges in poker by a really wide margin. So it's important that we get these ranges down, and at the end of the day, we only went over like 3 or 4 flops in the last video, so it seems worthwhile to at least do one more video on these ranges, if not more than one, because it's just such an important spot that's pretty common in the pot's big. One other thing I wanted to briefly point out, because it's something I've been thinking about for the last couple of weeks, is I feel much less confident about what sort of the correct way to defend against a button open in the small blind is than in probably any other pre-flop spot in poker. So what I mean by that is, in most pre-flop situations, I feel like I have a good sense of what's probably correct. I mean, of course, what I'm doing isn't going to be exactly correct, and I might even be off by more than I think in some spots, but it's probably pretty good in most spots, whereas when we're in the small blind, after the button opens, it's really tricky to tell what to do. Because right here, you can see I have a pretty clear cold calling range, like King 10 suited, pocket 8s, Queen Jack off. And all these hands do well against the button opening range, and by calling, we keep a lot of the hands that we have dominated in the button's opening range. But the problem with calling with these hands is it makes us very vulnerable to squeezes, because we don't slow play any really strong hands. And the difficulty, of course, with slow playing any really strong hands in the small blind against a button open is there's only one person left to act, which is the big blind, so we might not get squeezed at as high of a frequency as we'd like. And in addition, when the big blind cold calls, which he'll do quite often since the button's often min-raising or only 2.5ing, we have to play out of position multi-way with a strong hand, which isn't ideal. So one thing I am considering doing is I could 3-bet I could stop 3-betting some of these weaker hands. I'm just going to randomly click some of the weaker ones. It doesn't matter, just whatever. And then we could start 3-betting some of these stronger hands and just calling less or not at all. So that might be what we're supposed to do here, especially if we find right now the small blind 3-betting range has only 52% equity on the flop and is out of position. So maybe that's not quite enough equity to really prevent the button from wanting to call with a very wide range pre-flop. So, bit of a rant there, but long story short is, as we're looking at these ranges, it's possible that we should just stop cold calling these hands, instead start 3-betting them, and then we'll stop 3-betting our weakest 3-bet bluffs. Alright, let's jump in. Alright, so I randomly generated a flop, and then I added in the information we're going to need to format the hand. So the first board was King 10-2 Rainbow. So the first thing that I usually do when I see a flop now, and this is kind of whether I'm in position or out of position, but I think how hard is it to check a call? And on this board, when we're out of position, it's not going to be that difficult to check a call because there are like 10x hands, Queen X hands, pocket jack type hands that could check a call. That doesn't mean we need to check call all of them because we might want to bet them for a single street of value or, bet them for multiple streets of value or even check raise them if it's a really strong hand. But it's not that difficult to check call with sort of top pair and middle pair hands here. The next thing I want to do is see how equity's changed. Because my guess is on this board, the button range probably does pretty well. It would be doing even better if it had Queen 10 off. But even without that, the button cold calling range probably does pretty well because it calls with a lot of random 10 hands, like Ace 10 off, King 10 off, a lot of suited 10s, and then a good amount of queens as well. Queen Jack off, Ace Queen off, and King Queen off. So because of that, I think the button range is going to go up in equity, so let's see. Queen of spades, 10 of clubs, 2 diamonds. Oh, wow. Okay, so the button range has a lot more equity than I thought. I thought it would go up a little bit, but it went up like 7%, which is a big jump. So this is a very good range for the button caller because his equity just increased substantially, and that's usually going to mean it's a good flop for the button range if his equity goes up by a lot. So that's going to change the way we play this out of position, and it's also going to tie into what I said earlier, which is these hands maybe should be 3-bet pre-flop because they might not work that great as calls, and even if they're profitable calls, they might just be more profitable 3-bets, and this would, if we had 3-bet these hands, we'd connect on this board a lot better, because these hands right here include a lot of queens and tens, and it's just not that uncommon for the board to come queen high or 10 high. So it's important that we hit those queen high or 10 high boards. And here we just have a queen and a 10. So definitely something to think about. So I want to briefly discuss something before we jump into this board texture that's kind of difficult to explain. So bear with me. Balanced ranges are a byproduct of playing every hand in the most profitable way. So you should never really be saying to yourself, okay, I'm going to take this line for balance. So for example, you wouldn't say to yourself, I'm going to call with this set on a very, very wet board for balance purposes, even though I think raising is more profitable than calling. That doesn't make sense. You can never use balance as a justification for not taking a more profitable line. In theory, you always take the more profitable line, and this confuses people a lot. This confuses people especially since when they watch theory videos or Flopzilla videos from me, I talk about balance a lot. I use words like frequency and ratio a lot. But the reason why we have specific frequencies and ratios is because if we don't, our opponent can easily exploit us, and then that gives us an incentive to change our strategy to a more profitable line. So our end goal is always playing every single hand the most profitable way possible. So right here, it's important that when we are thinking about pre-flop ranges and stuff, we have to think we're taking the most profitable line at every single point. We can't ever think we're doing something just for the sake of balance. So if we were to find out somehow that 3-betting a hand like Queen Jack suited or Jack 10 suited is more profitable than calling, we would always 3-bet those hands, even if we're kind of tempted to say like, well, wait a second, don't we have to do something else for balance purposes? So balance is never our goal. Our goal is to play the most profitable, every hand as profitably as possible. And a byproduct of that is having balanced ranges because we can't be exploited. So just to say it one last time, a balanced range does not mean a range is optimal. What an optimal range means is every single hand is taking the most plus EV line possible. And that's what you want. You want an optimal range where every hand is playing the most profitable way that it possibly can be played. You're not looking just to balance ranges for the sake of being balanced. So I started writing this down really quickly. And then the other thing I wanted to point out here is I just replaced this Queen of Spades with a King of Spades just to see. And when we do this, the equity goes from the 3-betting range have 44.8% equity to 49 or basically 50% equity. So making this queen into a king increases the 3-betting range by over 5% equity, which is huge. So I know I've talked in old videos about how queen high boards tend to hit the 3-bet calling range pretty well. I'm still surprised to see the magnitude of this. Like a 5% change in equity is quite significant. So just be aware of that, and then, be sure to play around when you actually do Flopzilla stuff on your own. So now that I know this, and to be honest, I didn't know this that well before just having played around with Poker Stove and Flopzilla. But now that I know that the 3-betting range doesn't look like it's in very good shape right here, and the reason why it's not in very good shape is because the 3-betting range has less equity than the button, and it's out of position. And on top of that, if we look, the 3-betting range has an overpair or better 8.5% and top pair 21%, whereas the calling range has top pair 26% and an overpair about 6%. So even in terms of just a distribution of equity, it's not like the button cold calling range doesn't have some super strong hands. It's not like the 3-betting range in the small blind is like the super polarized range and the button range only has the bluff catchers. So they both have sort of a similar distribution of equity as well. Both can have some really strong hands and some really weak hands. One range isn't really polarized relative to the other. So when we take all that into account, it looks like the small blind 3-betting range is in pretty bad shape here. So what I would start with doing is say, let's see how we would defend this board if we only defended, or if we started out always by checking as the 3-better, because we think our opponent's range is stronger than ours, so we start out with checking our entire range. And if we find out that our checking range is too strong, then we'll know that our opponent would adjust by betting less because we're checking a very strong range, in which case we'll have to start creating a betting range as well. We can't just defend our checks, we'll also bet some. One thing I think that's tremendously helpful when trying to figure out how to play a range is to visualize the betting range as a luxury when you're out of position. Everyone always thinks like, how recklessly can I bet and still defend enough checks that it's not terrible, when that's not really the right thought process. It shouldn't be an afterthought for how you defend your checks. what's a better way to probably think about it is how many checks can I defend, where at that point I'm defending my checks too aggressively that my opponent won't bet. And now that I'm defending my checks too aggressively, I should bet some myself to weaken my checking range and give my opponent more of an incentive to bet so my check raises will succeed. So you want to first kind of focus on defending your checks sometimes, and then if you find out you're defending too many of your checks, then you can start betting. So betting is a luxury that you have if your checking range gets too strong. Okay, so we have 211 combos. If we checked a total of 211 combos, let's start with the check raising range. So I want to try to check raise reasonably aggressively here because it's not like our opponent is going to get punished that badly if we check a call. Because a lot of the hands our opponent might bluff with will be like gut shots or pairs or all that kind of random stuff. Probably not that many pairs here just because the 2 doesn't make any really low pairs, whereas if the 2 was like a 6, there'd be more gutters and pairs. Anyway, we want to check raise because that punishes our opponent a lot more than check calling does, because if we check call, he still gets to realize his equity, and he can have a fair amount of, gut shots here. And again, if the 2 was a 5 or a 6, he'd have more pairs as well. So, let's check raise like pocket kings. Kings seem like a good one because if our opponent bets with like a random ace, that's awesome if we check raise kings, because now he either has to put more money in the pot or fold an ace, which is going to outdraw us reasonably often. So let's start with check raising our kings. I also think we can go ahead and check raise aces. This one I'm a little bit more because aces also have a removal effect that I don't really like, which is they block our opponent's ace-queen, and that's probably a lot of what our opponent will call down with if we check raise. But I still think that's probably what we're going to want to do, so let me just look at the range a little bit more. We could also, I guess, check raise 10s instead, but 10s can be check called. All right, so let's actually do this. Let's check raise the 10s. I'm doing this because of the removal effect. Let's check raise the 10s, and then let's check call the aces. Because, if we have 10s, we're more likely to succeed with our check raise if our opponent bets ace-queen. Okay, so we got that going on. Let's see what else. We're going to check a call with also pocket queens. We just have a humongous removal effect there. Do we have any queen 10 suited? Unfortunately, we don't. Let's see what else we have. When we miss pocket 2s, that's just not fair. Like the one pocket pair, I don't 3-bet. Okay, so we have only 9 combos that we're check raising right now. I really want a few more than that. So what I would do is I would start just check raising the aces. So it was something that I said I didn't want to do because of the removal effect, and I still don't like the fact that aces have a removal effect. But at the end of the day, I want to get my check raising frequency up, because if I don't, our opponent's just going to have an incentive to bet super, super recklessly, because again, he's going to be nearly guaranteed to realize his equity because we're just so rarely check raising. So I'm going to check raise the aces too. So let's keep going with the easiest hand. So let's do the check calling range. So let's say we have ace queen, which is 12, king queen, which is 12. I'm just going to scroll right there. Queen 9 suited, which is 3, and that actually covers it. Okay. Let's see, any middle pairs, pocket jack, sure. Right, I guess pocket pair with low top pair. And then middle pair would be the ace 10s, which is 12, and the 10-8 suited, which is 10-8 suited, which is 3. Cool. All right, what else? So we have gutters and stuff, like some ace king. I talked about that a lot in the last video. It's something that is very, I think, non-intuitive for how useful ace king is in spots like this. So I'm not going to go over that whole thing again, but let's throw that in there. Let's throw in. So king jack could maybe be check raised, but I'm going to put that in here for now, the check calling range. And then let's see what else. I'm actually going to split the king jack. So I'm going to put 4 in the check raising range, and then I'm going to check call with the rest. And the reason for that is if we only check raise a super, super polarized range on this flop, like let's just imagine it in your head really quickly. Imagine on the flop, you're only check raising a super, super polarized range. So when you check raise, it's like an overpair, a set, or air. If you're check raising a super polarized range like that, why would the button ever 3-bet on the flop? He probably wouldn't, because he'd say to himself, okay, well, my opponent in the small blind is check raising such an incredibly polarized range that it's better for me to call with my entire defending range, because it's just not that useful to throw away your positional advantage and 3-bet into a range of air or the nuts. So because of that, it kind of helps if when you're check raising, you put a few hands in your range that maybe play really, really poorly if they get re-raised, but your opponent's not going to re-raise you all that often, and if you don't get re-raised, the hand plays pretty well. So King Jack, I think, is a pretty good example of that right here. Not an amazing example, but for this spot, it's workable. So with King Jack, if I check raise and my opponent folds, that's awesome. If I check raise and my opponent calls, that's fine too. I'm just going to jam the turn with a draw. And it's kind of hard to have a lot of draws on this board, especially on some turns if the turn's like a heart or a really low card. That maybe didn't give me that many flush draws. So that's nice as well. So King Jack is one of those hands that if I check raise it, the only really bad outcome is if my opponent jams on the flop. But here, and again, imagine yourself from the button's perspective this time. If you c-bet and you're in the button and your opponent check raises you in this small blind, in a 3-bet pot here, like the situation we're talking about, what hands are you 3-betting on the flop with? And my guess is you probably never 3-bet all in when you're in position here because you don't want to throw away your positional advantage. And if you have a really, really strong hand, you're just going to call and let your opponent keep bluffing. So King Jack, I think when we do check raise it, we're not going to face a 3-bet on the flop very often. So because of that, I prefer to check raise a few combos of King Jack. Okay, let's keep going. So gut opening and straight draws, we got those. Oh no, we didn't get the Jack 9 suited. I'll throw that in too. Jack 9 suited and no gut shots 9 8 suited. So let's throw the 9 8 suited in for the bluff raise. And then for the Jack 9 suited, we'll put that in we'll put that in the actually what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put the Jack 9 suited, which is the open and straight draw, in the check raising range, and I'm just gonna put all the King Jacks in the check calling range. Just makes it a little bit more organized, and Jack 9 suited is the exact same concept we just talked about. It can check raise the flop even if it hates getting 3-bet. Because it's probably just not going to get 3-bet all that often. Okay. So I'm going to just pause real quick and do a really quick count. So I've got 122 checks defended so far. And I don't think that's enough because our opponent's often going to be c-betting about half the pot. And since we're just check raising 15 combos for value, we're going to be able to check raise bluff some more hands. So we definitely have our work cut out for us still. Okay, so let's just keep looking. We got the King, Ace, King, the Ace, Jack, the King, Jack. Okay. So, and this is kind of a bad sign right here. Like, I'm already struggling a little bit to think about what other hands we should defend with, because I don't want to defend with these 5s, 4s, and 3s. These suited connectors aren't really getting the job done very well. We could sort of we could check raise bluff like a 9-7 suited, I think. So this one, since we're just going to do the 3 combos with the flush draw. Let's see if we can check raise another 3 combos that are similar to that. So we have already 9-8 suited there. We could check raise like a King. We could check raise like a King 8 suited too. Okay, so that gets us to 29 combos right here. So the other thing we're going to want to do is check call with some hands that are going to be bluffed later unless they improve. And I'm not thrilled about this, but you do need to check, like, again, imagine you're actually playing here. The flop comes this, Queen 10-2, and imagine you're in position again this time against the small blind at 3-bet. If the small blind check called you on the flop, do you ever think he would be floating you out of position? And by floating, I mean like check calling you with like Ace 9 of spades, or I guess since we don't have Ace 9 of spades here, Ace 7 of spades. You probably wouldn't. You'd probably almost always put your opponent on like some random queens, pocket jacks, or a 10x hand. But in reality, check calling some of those suited aces can be good because they give us a hand to bluff later on. And if we don't check call with those hands, we're just not defending our checks very aggressively here. So I would check call with at least a few of those. We might not defend so many checks that our opponent can't profitably bet any 2 cards, but I think we can still defend a little bit more aggressively than this. This is actually turned out to be a pretty hard hand to analyze. And I think I miscounted this real quickly. So 15, 19, 23. Okay, so this is... No, that's fine. So I think our check raising range is pretty much done. So we're just going to try to check call a few more hands. So let's see. Let's say we go... Come on. Why isn't this working? Okay, cool. Let's say we're going to call with A7 suited 3, A6 suited 3, or let's say Ace 5 suited 3, Ace 4 suited 3, Ace 3 suited 3. Okay, so that would get us to 111 combos plus 29 combos. So total checks defended would be 140. So we'd be defending about 2/3 of our checks. So here, it's possible I'm missing some hands. And just fun fact, I actually redo these recordings a ton. So if it sounds like I'm rambling and I'm just kind of like throwing this video together, I assure you that's not what's happening. It's just very hard to try to explain stuff while you're thinking and moving through stuff. So it's very possible I'm missing a hand here. But for the most part, I don't think I am. So I still had trouble defending enough of our checks, even if we checked our entire range on the flop. So that to me looks like we should not have a c-betting range on this flop. That doesn't disgust me as much as it probably is going to disgust a lot of people that are viewing this. They're probably going to think, oh my gosh, they c-bet this board a ton. But if you really think about it, the queen and the 10 just hit the button cold calling range pretty well. And since we weren't 3-betting these hands, we ended up kind of not doing too well on this board. So just a certain flop texture, the queen 10-2, isn't going to be enough of a reason to encourage us to 3-bet all these hands. But it's just another way I'm seeing that I'm starting to like the idea of 3-betting these hands more, which makes my 3-betting range stronger. And then I just kind of stop calling on the small blind against the button open. I'm not sure that's right. I might have a much different opinion in a month or two from now as I've done more work on this. But right now, just another hand example, which is kind of making me want to do that. All right, so I'm going to double count everything, and then we'll talk for one more minute about the hand. So this way, we're defending 66.4% of our checks. So if I was going to do analysis on this hand, I would write myself a note like this, and it's already what I was just explaining. So this board showcases why maybe I should be 3-betting with the queen jack off, or the queen jack off, queen jack suited, king 10 suited, king 9 suited, etc. type hands. The small blind 3-betting range might just be too weak, and here it seems to miss on a reasonably common board. One way to fix this is by 3-betting a stronger range, and I don't particularly like calling in the small blind against a button open, even if it feels right, or even if, I don't even want to say feels right, even if it feels right to have some small blind calling range. Remember, and again, even though I know this, I would take a note of it. Remember, in theory, all hands must be played the most plus EV way. You can't just make ranges so they look pretty or balanced. You have to believe you're playing all hands the most plus EV way. I still don't like cold calling in the small blind with, king 10 suited, because it sucks when the big blind calls and I'm multi-way out of position, and it sucks when I get squeezed. And that note might seem like a really long note, but honestly, it's probably too short. I should also keep writing about how, even if my small blind 3-betting range were stronger here, so even if I did start 3-betting the hands that I'm currently calling with and then started folding some of the weaker ones that I'm currently 3-betting with, my range still would probably not be awesome here, small blind versus button. So I would still have to defend my checks very aggressively, make sure I'm check raising over pairs when I need to, check raising sets, check raising 2 pairs, defending my checks because I also want to check call quite a bit here. So I should also take a note how people are just c-betting way too much on this board when they're the 3-better, which isn't surprising, but especially on this board, they're probably 3-betting way too much, c-betting way too much after 3-betting, and I do not want to play that way even if I had a stronger range here. At the end of the day, people that are willing to do this stuff that I imagine most people find pretty boring, like organizing their thoughts right like this, actually writing down their thoughts and even saying it out loud, all that stuff's been shown to increase, your ability to remember that much better. But at the end of the day, most people, when they say they want to get better at poker, they prefer to do it the lazier way. They might say, oh, I spent an hour studying poker when they just read 2+2 small stakes forums. That's not an hour of studying poker like this is. So if your goal is to get a lot better, I would recommend doing the boring stuff, which means when you have a significant hand like this, where you kind of get shown a lot of concepts at once, I would write down all those things, even if it takes a couple of minutes. So the next flop I randomly generated was this one right here, the King 6-3 with the flush draw. And when I plug it in here, we see that the equity is 56.7%. So the equity of our 3-betting range increased by 5%. So that's a pretty significant jump in equity. And whenever you look at something like this, it's always a good idea to play around with it a little bit. So the king high board makes sense. That would hit our 3-betting range, since our opponent would usually 4-bet in the button with his hands like ace king. So the fact that the board's king high does favor the 3-betting range. So let's see ace high. Okay, ace high is good too. Queen high, significantly less useful. Jack high, closer to the queen high board. So it looks like when we hit in terms of just equity, when we hit the king or the ace high flop, that's significantly better than the queen or the jack high. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump in then. So the flop is king of diamonds, 6 of diamonds, 3 of spades. Total combos is 204. Let's start with the value betting range. So I think we're going to be value betting like aces, which is 6 combos, ace king, which is 12. Probably king queen, which is 12 as well. So if you're unsure whether or not to value bet king queen with all 3 streets, one thing you could do is just sort of quickly calculate, look at the button's flatting range, and see if the opponent will need to call down with hands weaker than king queen. So if we bet half pot on the flop, turn and river, our opponent needs to call down with about 2/3 of his range on the flop, times 2/3 of his range on the turn, times 2/3 of the range on the river. It'd probably be a little bit more than this, so probably like 32 or 33%. And if we look at the button flatting range, the button flatting range only has top pair or better 22.3%. So we're probably going to be doing okay to value bet king queen for all 3 streets here. So remember, when value betting the river and we're out of position, it's okay if we win less than half the time when called. But when we're in position, we need to make our value bets win over half the time when called. Otherwise, we're better off checking. Since we're out of position here with king queen on the river, it's going to be okay to bet even if we win less than half the time when called. All right, so what else can we bet with? So I think we'd also want to bet hands like at least jacks, or I don't want to say at least jacks, but I think like pocket tens can be bet for a single street of value. We might make our opponent fold a hand like ace jack, which is nice, and then we could check call with our hand on the turn. We might even want to do the same strategy with a hand like pocket jacks. As I've mentioned before, there's a hand like king 7 suited and pocket queens here is very, very similar. So if we have a hand like king 7 suited or pocket queens, so those kind of hands that are good but not great, the top pair no kicker type hands, we want to bet with some on the flop and check call some on the flop. If we never bet those hands on the flop, then it's hard to bet the flop and check call the turn. But if we always bet those hands on the flop like most people do, then we don't protect our flop checking range. So here I say let's bet with jacks to tens. Let's say we're going to check call pocket queens. And then we're probably going to check call, I'd say, let's say we're going to check call with most of the king X suited too. So let's just put them in here for now. So king 8 suited to king 7 suited, which is 6. King 5 suited and king 4 suited, which is 6. And then we might find out, like, maybe if we're not betting enough. So these hands are the kind of hands I plan to bet 1 street for value and check call the turn. If we find out we need to be betting more hands for 1 street of value and check calling the turn, we'll move some of these hands to the value betting range. All right, so that looks like a good start. Let's also check call on the flop with pocket kings. That hand has a pretty big removal effect, so it's hard to get a lot of value by betting, especially if we bet multiple streets. So let's just call them on the flop. And then with pocket threes, let's check raise them. We might need to make this range a little bit more aggressive, because right now all we're doing is check raising pocket threes. We could also throw in something like king 6 suited here, though. That's another 3 combo. So this can be sort of our value check raising range, the pocket threes and the king 6 suited. And then we'll add in some bluffs in a minute. Okay, so it's probably close, and you would need to calculate it, but I feel pretty good about value betting king queen for all 3 streets. A hand like King Jack, we might only want to bet. It's going to depend on what the turn in the river come. So when I put like King Jack 12 here, I don't know if we're going to go, bet, check, call, or if we're going to bet all three streets, or exactly what. But I think I would go ahead and value bet King Jack. I think our check calling range already looks pretty solid. We just have a lot of good hands already. So I would just go ahead and throw the King Jack into the value betting range since our check calling range looks pretty protected. But we'll come back to that again later in check. So right now we have 6, 18, 30, maybe 42 hands that are going to bet all three streets, and 12, maybe 24 hands that will bet one or two streets. So with that in mind, I think we're going to want, let's just assume we have like 36 good value betting hands here, as well as maybe 20 hands that are going to bet one or two streets. So then if we keep in mind that for every very strong hand we value bet, we want 1.5 bluffs. So 36 times 1.5 is going to get us 54. And then if we add a few extra bluffs for the hands that are only betting one or two streets of value, maybe we want something like, 65 or 70 bluffs after we add in some draws. So let's just shoot for 70 bluffs right now. And then we'll tally this up. So this is going to be 54. And then we have 70 or so bluffs. And then let's see what hands we want to bet with that are draws. So we have 16 flush draws on the flop. So let's just say we're going to bet with 12 of them. And then do we have any? Oh, we do have open-ended straight draws. So let's say 15 flush draws, and let's say we bet all the straight draws. So 5-4 suited, 3. So that gives us 15 draws. So unsurprisingly, this is a board where we're going to be able to bet pretty aggressively because it hits our range very well. And since it hits our range very well, and we also have most of the premium hands, like we have the ace-kings specifically, we expect our opponent to have fewer hands that want to bet for 3 streets of value, so it makes sense that we have the aggressive betting range. We not only have more equity, but we also probably have a few more of the really, really good hands. Okay, and then we're going to have to add in a whole bunch of bluffs. So let's just tally this up real quick. If we were to, so that'd be 54 plus 15 for 69 plus 70, so 139. So as of right now, we're betting about 2/3 of the time on this flop, which is pretty aggressive. But again, it seems reasonable here since our range has 57% equity. Okay, so let's start adding in some bluffs. All right, so actually we had 4 flush draws that we're going to check call, so let's do that. Flush draws. Let's say we check call 2, and let's say we check raise bluff 2. Something like that. Okay, so the bluffing range. Let's start with the easiest, most obvious bluffs. I think, and this seems a little weird, but I think we can bet 5s and 4s. So maybe we're not starting with the most obvious ones. But 5s and 4s here, it's possible we bet them on the flop, our opponent calls with ace-queen, and then he checks down and we win. I like that about betting 5s and 4s. I don't think if we check, our opponent will... our opponent might check back again like an ace-queen and if we check 5s or 4s on the flop. So we can win after betting on the flop with 5s or 4 or with checking. But I like the aspect of betting 5s and 4s that we still might get called by ace-queen or ace-jack and then it checks down. And in addition, of course, when we bet 5s or 4s, we can make our opponent just fold some high-equity hands that can outdraw us. So I'd probably bluff 5s or 4s. The last thing, which is also quite important here, is if we bluff 5s or 4s, we'll have 2 outs to the set and 4 outs to the open-ended straight draw on the turn. So 5s and 4s are a little bit more likely to improve than just a random pocket pair since they do make 3 to a straight. So I'm going to go ahead and bet those. Then for the... So I would just count all the random spades we have. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. These are pairs. 7. So we have 7 random spade hands. And then in addition to that, we have the aces. So 8, 9, 10, 11. Sorry, since ace-3 suited doesn't count. So I'm not sure that's precise, but I would just put something like XX of spades. That's 11 combos. No big deal if we're off by a combo or 2. All right, so we got that. I think we're going to want to barrel with ace of diamonds, 10x. That's another 3 combos. I didn't count this ace of spades there. We also have some random pairs we can bet with. So if we look at the pairs of 6s, we have 3 combos of ace-6 suited, 3 of 8-6, 3 of 7-6, and 3 of 6-5 suited. So let's say the bluffing range is going to be 6, we'll just list them. Ace-6 suited, 3, king-6 suited, 3, 6-5 suited, 3, and 7-6 suited. Again, these hands might end up betting one street for value and their opponent actually checks back, checks down with worse. That's cool when that happens. Like, we can easily bet ace-6 suited on the flop. He calls with 6-7 suited and it checks down. So the terms value bet and bluff really don't work perfectly, but when we're trying to get a rough estimate of a balanced range, these hands are probably going to be closer to bluffs. Okay, we also have gut shots. Let's scroll over those. Take this out. So we only have 7-5 suited. Okay. What else do we have? I also think on this flop, we can bet any ace-jack hand that has a runner-runner flush draw. So that would be the ace-jack of spades or any ace-jack hand with a single diamond. So that makes up a total of 7 combos. So I would just put something like ace-jack 7. And I know what that means. You know what that means since I just explained it. But when you're doing this stuff on your own, you'll probably have your own notation that you can remember. And a lot of times I would check call ace-queen on a board like this. I was just talking about how we still might check call ace-queen here, but I'm open to the idea of betting it here because we already have so many hands that can check call and check raise, and we want to have an aggressive flop betting range. So ace-queen we might end up betting here as well. We'll have to wait and see. But right now it looks like we've kind of taken out all the really easy value bets or bluffs. So now it's time to get a little more detailed. So let me tally up this bluffing range real quick. So right now we have 50 combos, but I want 70. Or around 70. It doesn't need to be precise. So I'm going to start adding in more bluffs. So let's throw in the ace of, the ace with just the 10 of diamonds. That gives us another 3. And then I'm also going to bluff with the ace-queen. So again, I have no problem with check calling ace-queen here, especially like an ace-queen with a diamond. But for right now, I'm just going to bluff with, I want to think if I want to use all the ace-queens. Probably not. I'm going to start with at least just the 7. So once again, this is the ace-queen with the backdoor flush draw. So that gets 60 combos total. I'd still like a few more bluffs. So now I'm at the point where I'm like actually having to try to find these bluffs. So when that happens, it means, usually you're going to pause and look around to try to figure out exactly what's going on. But if I'm like trying to actually figure out how to find enough bluffs, then that means I'm going to start bluffing with some hands which I maybe wouldn't have originally thought to. So that might be like the offsuit ace-queen as I just mentioned. Or it could even be some other weaker hands, like maybe we want to bluff with like a 7-8 suited hand, even if it doesn't have the backdoor flush draw. Because even a hand like, let's say, 8-7 suited, I'm just going to add it in right now. So we have 63 combos total in the bluffing range. But even a hand like 8-7 suited, it has 8 outs to the open-ended straight draw, and then it has another 6 outs to a pair. So even 8-7 suited can be bluffed reasonably well on the turn. I usually wouldn't think it's strong enough to use as a bluff, but here, I think it's going to be doable. I also just noticed I didn't add ace-3 suited earlier, so let's put that in. So that gets us to 66 combos total, and then let's go ahead and bump the ace-queen from 7 combos to 11. So even though this seems very cluttered right now, when I say ace-queen 11, that just means we're betting all the ace-queen. That just means we're betting 11 out of our 16 ace-queen combos. So 11 out of our 15 ace-queen combos that aren't a flush draw. And so we are going to start with checking some ace-queen, but we're betting the majority of them. That happens all the time in theory where you take different lines with different hands. And honestly, even with ace-queen, I could see an argument for betting some of the ace-queen with the runner-runner flush draw and check calling with some ace-queen with the runner-runner flush draw. We're not going to get too anal about that because it's just, we're not going to be able to be that precise. But just know, ace-queen's probably a hand that's reasonable to take multiple lines with here. Whereas the ace-jack, these are the hands that I would want to bet with the backdoor flush draw because I'm planning on check folding the ace-jack that I don't bet. Whereas with ace-queen, I might be planning on check calling some of the ace-queen that I don't bet. One thing we want to be careful about with a range like this is right now we only have 2 flush draws that are check calling. So that means it's very, very hard for us to bluff on a later street because we just don't have that many air hands. So maybe we can fix that by check calling with like 5 ace-queen combos, and those are the hands that we can use as a bluff later on in addition to the flush draw. So something like this seems reasonable. So I'm going to double count everything to make sure we're on the same page. Cool, and we are. So we bet 139 combos, so out of a total of 204. So 139 divided by 204 equals 68%. And then we check the total of 204 minus 139. 204 minus 139. So we checked a total of 65 combos. So 65 combos were checked. This is 3, 9, 15, 21, 23, 27. And then we check raised. This is 8 combos right here, but we're going to add some bluffs. So it looks like we're actually going to pretty much hit the nail on the head here, even at our first kind of guess. It looks like our flop checking range is going to be pretty reasonable. So we need to have some hands that can check raise bluff. And even though I put them in the betting range on the flop, honestly, the kind of hands that might make really good check raise bluffs here would probably be like the weak pairs with 5 outs on the turn, or with a hand that can just turn a random flush draw that can jam all in. So let's think what gets that done. Okay, so for example, we could have moved a hand like some of the ace X of spades. We bet all of them here, but maybe we should be check raising with, I'm just going to make it up, like 4 ace X of spades, or 2 ace X of spades hands and 2 random pairs. And in which case we would need to, take these out of our flop betting range and add in a few more random bluffs. And again, we're running out of like kind of goodish bluffs here, so we're just really gonna have to stretch it. So the hands we might have to bluff on the flop would be like, I already got the 8-7 suited. Maybe we'd even have to bluff like some Queen-9 suited hands or something like that too. I'm not going to worry about that right now and get too anal for just a few more combos. So let's say we're just going to put bluff 4 here. So I know I didn't get the exact combos here because I would want to probably bluff with some. If I was going to check raise bluff, I'd probably want to use one of the hands I put in the bluffing range to begin with, or in the flop, the flop C betting range. And I don't want to just spend the time getting detailed with that. So we'll just put bluff 4. So that gets a 6, 9, 12. And notice even in here, we're value check raising 6 strong hands and only bluffing 4 hands. But that's because after we check raise in a 3-bet pot, the pot's already massive, so we just can't be bluffing that much. So this is a total of 39 checks. Let's see, 39 divided by 65, 39 divided by 65. So we're defending 60% of our checks. That looks pretty good to me. I don't really have a problem if we check on this flop and our opponent can profitably bet any 2 cards. First of all, if you can bet any 2 cards here, it's not going to be that profitable because we're still defending 60% of our checks. But, again, if we checked our opponent on the flop, we've shown weakness, he has position, it doesn't seem unreasonable for him to sometimes be able to make a slightly profitable flop bet, especially when you also need to remember, any hand he checks back on the flop will also have a positive EV. So always keep that in mind. It's very easy when you're making ranges to think like, how do I make my opponent break even? Well, think about it. Even if our opponent has the worst hand in his range on the flop, his flop check will have some EV. So let's see what that hand could be. So even in a spot like this, this is the range. The worst hand our opponent can probably have is going to be a hand like Jack-9 suited without the flush draw. Even Jack-9 suited without a flush draw can still turn pairs. It still has 6 outs to pairs, right? It still can runner flushes and stuff like that. It can still sometimes runner 2-pair trips. Jack-9 of hearts still has some EV here. So if our opponent can make a slightly profitable flop bet with Jack-9 of hearts after we've shown weakness, doesn't seem like a problem to me. This range looks quite reasonable. So here, this range actually was much easier to balance than the other ones we looked at. So if I was going to write notes to myself, I would just say, pretty easy to play a king-high flop. We want to bet aggressively, around 2/3 of the time. And we're still able to comfortably defend our checks. And then I would also just take a note of anything I wanted to remind myself of, like if it's a specific league I know I have. So I would maybe say something here like, don't be lazy and remember to check raise hands like 3-3. It still helps to have some check raising range on this flop. And if our opponent does check back the flops, if our opponent does check back the flop when we have 3-3, he will almost never outdraw us on the turn, and we can start betting for value ourselves. So again, I just took some random little note. And the reason why I took this note specifically here is, even though I understand this stuff, it's still, you're going to remember it much better if you write it down, and it's still good to kind of hear myself say, hey, if I have pocket 3s on this flop, I might be reluctant to check it on the flop, because if I check it and my opponent checks back, I'll be like, oh, shucks, I wanted him to bet. But at the end of the day, if I have pocket 3s and my opponent has a really good hand, I'm going to stack them whether or not I bet it or check it on the flop anyways. And by checking with pocket 3s, I give my opponent the opportunity to bluff, and if my opponent checks back, I can start making very reasonable sized bets on the turn in the river, hoping my opponent thinks I was, check folding on the flop, and now I'm bluffing. And also, my opponent might be more willing to, call down on the turn in the river when there's less streets left to act, when he does have a hand like pocket tens or pocket nines or something. So very reasonable to check a hand like pocket threes on the flop here. When the check raise is successful, that's awesome. But even when it's not, we can still get value on the turn in the river. And people are often afraid to check strong hands on boards when the opponent can have flush draws. But again, keep in mind, if we have pocket threes on this flop and our opponent has like a flush draw or a gut shot, he's almost always going to bet anyways. So we're really not going to lose much value from our opponent when he has a gut shot or a flush draw and we end up check raising rather than betting. We might even get a little bit more value. Okay, so let's do another board. No whammy, no whammy, no whammy, no whammy. Stop! All right, 10, 3, 2 with a flush draw. So actually reasonably similar to the last board we did where we had one high card and then two low cards and a flush draw. So let's go ahead and just plug this in. I actually don't know exactly what the equity is going to be here, so I'm kind of curious. So sometimes when I'm doing stuff like this, I'll kind of guess to see how far off I am. I'm guessing the 3-betting range has like 51.5% equity here. Okay, so only 50% equity. And the reason why I guess 51.5% equity, which is significantly less than on the king high board, is if you just look at the button flatting range, it includes a lot more tens and stuff like king 10 off. So that's why I guessed it would be less, and it was less by even more than I thought. So let's go ahead and jump right in by writing out the flop, which is 10 of clubs, 3 of clubs, 2 of diamonds, and then the total combos is going to be 201. Let's move everything to the same spot. Okay. So, as usual, let's start with what seems like sort of the obvious hands. All right, so now here for the value betting hands, and again, it's not like I know this stuff for sure, but this is just my guess. I want to bet the hands that are strong yet can still be outdrawn. So the hands that seem like really obvious bets to me here are going to be like hands like, I don't even know if if kings are going to be bets. Maybe they'll get check raised or check called since our range isn't all that strong here. But I think we're going to want to bet like queens to jacks. I think we're going to want to bet ace 10. And as I talked about earlier, with regards to sort of considering 3-betting these type of hands right here, it'd be nice if we did here, because then we'd have more top pair hands, which make check calling quite a bit easier and allow us to bet hands for 1 or 2 streets of value more effectively. Here we don't really have that. Luckily, we do have 12 combos of ace 10 since we 3-bet the ace 10 off. 12 combos of queens to jacks right there. And yeah, so again, this range is having the problem where if you don't 3-bet these types of hands, it's hard to balance on this board, which is why I'm having some second thoughts about using a range that's this sort of polarized. But again, that's something that I still have to think about and work on a little bit more. So let's start with that. And then let's start with saying we want to check raise some hands here. So let's say we're going to be check raising pocket threes for 3 combos. Let's say we're going to check call pocket tens for 3 combos. And then, you know what? If we're going to be checking here more often, which I think we are, let's say we're going to also check raise some pocket aces. And let's say we see bet the pocket kings. Just starting it off. So I'm still really concerned here about the check calling range because there aren't hands that I really want to check call with. So we can check call with 10-8 suited, but we just don't have random pairs of tens. Like we whiff on this 10 high flop. Yeah, if you look, it says top pair 6.8%. So I do think that's something that's wrong with this range. So in a vacuum, like if you're not thinking about your entire range, I think this 3-betting range will work very, very well from the small blind. It's one that I've had a lot of success for when I was playing. I won a lot from 3-betting from the blinds with a range very similar to this. This one's a little bit more aggro than I used, but all these hands make good 3-bet bluffs, but we're just whiffing 10 high boards, which suggests there's some theoretical problems with this range. Namely, we're not 3-betting enough pairs of tens. All right, so let's still try to work with the range that we have. So we can check call some like ace-king hands. I'd say we check call all those that aren't the flush draw. Yeah, something like that seems reasonable. So I just added some hands in and ended up mostly rambling as I tried to figure this out. So I deleted that slide, but I want to keep the work that I did and talk about it. So I moved ace-king to the value betting range because if we look here, the button only has a pair on this flop or a better a third of the time, 34.3%. So it's very reasonable for us to start off with betting ace-king on the flop. We're almost never going to, or I shouldn't say that. We can start off with betting ace-king on the flop. We're not going to get raised all that often. And that's a whole long discussion to talk about how often our opponent should raise here. But we can bet ace-king on the flop, and then if our opponent calls our flop bet, we can often check call it on the turn. So I'm considering ace-king a hand that can actually bet one street for value, because our opponent will have to float us with a lot of hands that ace-king beats, and then we can check call on the turn. Likewise, we could also bet with 5s and 4s on the flop and check call on the turn, but it's harder to check call on the turn with 5s and 4s since they're less likely to improve on the turn or the river. So even though in terms of absolute strength, 5s and 4s are better than ace-king, in reality, ace-king is a significantly better hand. So since I decided to bet ace-king on the flop, I took ace-king out of the check calling range. And again, ace-king would make a good check call. I don't have any problem with that line, but trying to get stuff to balance, I decided to check a call with ace-queen instead. Okay, so that's where I was after doing my little rant and having to delete the slide, so let's keep going. So I'm just trying to find other stuff that seems sort of obvious for what we should do. There's nothing really that's seeming super obvious to me right now. So I'm going to go ahead and tally this stuff up. So again, I added some hands, then ended up rambling. So let me just show you what I did, because I didn't want to delete them all again. So I started tallying up the hands, and then I decided to c-bet the gut shots for a total of, an extra 9 bluffs. And then for the check raises, I wanted to check raise this 8-3 and ace-2 suited, which are pairs, which can improve on the turn. And another thing I want to do is I also want to sort of count the runner diamond flush draw hands that I have, and then I want to check raise some, since if I check raise the flop with, let's say, I'm just going to put it down here, let's say ace-6 of diamonds, ace-7 of diamonds, and let's say king-5 of diamonds, or king-4 of diamonds, these are the type of hands that I can jam if I turn a diamond on the... Sorry, these are the hands that can jam on the turn when I turn a flush draw. And the cool thing about check raise bluffing with like king-6 of diamonds is if my opponent goes all in, I don't care. It's not like I'm in love with king-6 of diamonds, so I can check raise it, hope I turn a king or a diamond on the turn, and if I do, be like, yeah, and then go all in. And if I don't, no big deal. If you blast me off and on the flop, no big deal. So that should get us to, we have 9 hands that were value check raising, 3 bluffs, then an extra 9 hands that were value check raising, 3 draws, then an extra 8 bluffs. That seems reasonable enough. So that's 9 plus 3, which is 12, plus another 8, which gets us to 20. And even as I'm just doing this, I'm just thinking to myself how much I like this range. Like, I really like the idea of check raise bluffing king-3 or king-4 of diamonds, because, as I just said, it's not a big deal if I get blasted off and on the flop. And if I don't get blasted off and on the flop, I can easily jam a 5 or a diamond turn, or be pretty happy when I turn a king. So really like having this check raising range here. It protects our checks. If it checks through when we have aces or pocket 3s, it's not a big deal. We can get value on later streets. Our opponent's pretty much always going to bluff his draws on the flop anyways, which means check raising these value hands is going to be very effective. So really like this check raising range. It's something I did not have in my game when I was playing, but I think it's a pretty big deal and it's relatively easy to do. So just take note of that. It's probably a good range to develop, and it's not going to be that hard. Okay, so adding more stuff. So we still got a lot of bluffs that we need to add. I counted 30 sort of strongish value hands in our value betting range and 15 very, very weak value bets. So because of that, I only wanted to have around 45 bluffs. So far we've got 21, so we're going to have to add about 24 more bluffs. So let's see, what are the obvious bluffing hands? So let's count how many like random diamond hands we have. We have probably 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So let's say we're going to bet 13, and again, I might not have counted that perfectly, but like XX of diamonds hands, we have like 13 random diamonds we want to bet with. And then other hands that I think make pretty good bluffs here are just going to be like the backdoor flush draw king queen, the backdoor flush draw ace jack, and the backdoor flush draw king jack. So let's count that. Let's tally that up right now. So my apologies. I know I've done this a few times already, but I ended up tallying it, discussing it, ended up messing up with my discussion, so I had to delete the recording, and I don't want to erase all the hand combos that I wrote down. So let me discuss them for a little bit. On the flop, if we were originally bluffing 55 hand combos, which I think is a little bit too much, given how weak our value bets are right here. These 30 hand combos can probably bet all 3 streets most of the time, but these aren't super strong value bets that I think we should be able to bluff that aggressively. So what I did is I stopped bluffing with ace jack of the runner flush draw, because ace jack also does pretty well if it checks through. So now I'm not saying that, maybe, for example, maybe we'd be better off c-betting with ace jack rather than king jack or something like that. But the point that I wanted to make is when you're thinking about what hands you want to c-bet bluff with, you don't only just think about how well does your hand retain its equity, you also want to think how well would your hand do if it checks back. So ace jack, for example, like it could make sense to bluff with king jack, the weaker hand, and to check with ace jack, the stronger hand, even if ace jack plans on check folding, because ace jack might do better if our opponent checks back. So for example, maybe ace jack can rarely win at showdown when our opponent just decides to never bluff on this board, whereas king jack will pretty much never do that. So it could make sense to check ace jack on this board rather than king jack, because ace jack might do better if it checks through, but in reality, it's not going to be a big deal either way, and you might do something like bet king of clubs with the, maybe something like this should actually be what we bet. We bet king of clubs with the random jack, the ace of clubs with the random jack, and then we bet ace jack of diamonds and king jack of diamonds. So something like that might be best. But I did want to make the point that it can make sense to bluff with a weaker hand and check fold a better hand if you think that hand that you're check folding does better against your opponent's checking range. So make sure you understand that. It can be okay to check fold a pretty good hand because that hand will do so well when it checks through, but it's not quite strong enough to check call a flop bet. Okay, so that gets us to 49 hand combos, which is close enough. So if we did that, we were c-betting a total of 114 combos on the flop, which is going to be 56 or 57%. And then we were checking a total of 87 hand combos on the flop. So right here, if we're checking 87 hand combos on the flop and we're defending 46 checks, we're going to be defending about 54% of the time. So here with the ranges we have, we're c-betting a little more than half the time and we're defending a little more than half of our flop checks. This doesn't look bad, but there's still enough things wrong with this range that I would probably want to tweak my pre-flop range so that I can check call more comfortably on 10 high boards. It wouldn't be a huge tweak, but right now, the range that I have that we're check calling, pocket 10s look like a fine check call, 10-8-2 looks like a fine check call, ace-queen looks like a fine check call, and some flush draws look like a fine check call. But the problem is I don't have enough pairs in this range that make me feel like my overall check calling range is balanced. So because of that, it'd be a little bit better if I had like 3-bet pocket 9s on the flop and check called them on the flop. Though to be honest, I wouldn't really like that line. I mean, it would make sense for balancing our check calling range. I just think it would be arguably better as a flop bet. But one thing we could have done is like if we would have 3-bet a hand like king 10 pre-flop or queen 10 pre-flop, those hands would probably be more comfortable to check call. Because with queen 10, there's less overcards that can come. So it's a little bit easier to check call because if the turn card comes a queen, we're still doing quite well with queen 10. So just keep that in mind that even though I think we were able to get reasonably balanced range on this flop, it's not like this is the exact optimal pre-flop range, so one thing I would do is start 3-betting with a few more marginal 10s, which can then be check called on the flop and will probably help us out from a balancing perspective. The other thing to note is if we find out we're not defending enough of our flop checks, like for example, we're only defending here 54% of the time, so our opponent can clearly bet any two cards profitably if he makes a half-pot c-bet. One thing we could consider doing is check raising more aggressively. So here, since we didn't completely, nail our range on this flop, it's possible we're c-betting here a little bit too aggressively. My guess is we actually are. So one thing we could do is we could take a few of the hands that we're value betting with right now, move them to the check raising range. That results in us betting the flop a little bit less aggressively, but since we're check raising, we're able to defend more of our checks, and that will overall make us able to, defend more aggressively against our opponent. So I would take notes on this hand as follows. Notes. I really like the check raising range here and think it's absolutely critical to making our, flop checking range make sense. If we don't check raise, our opponent will recklessly bet, and it'd be more profitable to have checked our premium hands planning on check raising than it was to continuation bet them to begin with. So the first thing I would note to myself is the check-raising ratio, I think, looks really good. And then the second thing I would say is also note we're not having many hands that can check call on the 10 high board. We don't have many pretty good 10x hands like, you know, King 10, Queen 10, or Jack 10. And so the only pair we're check calling with is 10-8. And as I mentioned before, if we did have a hand like pocket nines, we could see bet it on the flop. I realize 10-8, which we check called, isn't that different from pocket nines. But my point is, there is a big difference between whether or not, you know, we have a hand like Queen 10, which wants the turn to come a queen, and if we have a hand like pocket nines or 10-8, which hate it when the turn card comes a queen. So I would make a note to myself, like, my guess is we should be 3-betting some of the, you know, Queen 10 suited, Queen Jack. I know Queen Jack isn't hitting on this board, but something like this, hands that we're currently calling with. So, there aren't really any hands in our range that I have a huge problem with. I'm just noticing from an overall balance perspective, I don't think we're able to play 10 high boards that effectively, so I would probably imagine in theory we should put some more 10x hands in our range. So that wraps up the new content for this video. But before we end, I wanted to point out that I would really appreciate feedback regarding this video, because as you can probably tell when you're watching this, the kind of stuff we're talking about, out of position 3-bet pot flop play, I'm less comfortable with than I am with most of the stuff that I talk about in videos. So when I make a general theory video or when I talk about single raise pots, I've done a lot more work on that stuff, so I'm much more comfortable with it when I randomly generate a flop. I've usually seen stuff before. I've usually explained the same concept many times before, whereas this stuff is much more new to me. So what I want your feedback for is, I'm going to, of course, do a mix of both, but do people like it when I'm talking about like new content that you probably haven't seen anywhere else, stuff that I'm currently working on? But when I do talk about new content, I'm more likely to be wrong at first. I'm more likely going to have to backtrack and then, you know, say, hey, you know, I recorded this, then I had to re-record it, but I don't want to delete all the work I've done. Are you more okay with that? Or would you prefer it if I only talked about stuff I already knew really well? And the other problem is if I only talk about stuff I already know really well, that's going to be the concepts that people are already more comfortable with, because it's going to be the easier, probably even more important stuff. And that's also going to be stuff that you're able to get from the 2+2 book more easily. Whereas if I do stuff like this, it's newer, more advanced stuff. So it's harder for me to do, and I'm probably less skilled at explaining myself than I am if I do the old stuff. But again, it's newer stuff, and this might be stuff that people are more interested in right now. So please give me feedback. Exactly, you know, let me know, did this video work for you? Are you okay with newer content where I'm a little, you know, I'm struggling a little bit more to explain it? Or do you prefer it if I wait until I really get like a solid foundation on this, then I start making the videos? In which case, it'll just be less, again, it will be less newer content, but it will probably be explained a little bit better. So let me know that, because that's something I'm very curious to hear about. And again, no matter what people say, I'm definitely going to do a mix of both. I just like to know what people overall prefer more. So, thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned a bunch. Take care, guys. Bye.